I would like to first start with the announcement that was made in Washington, and basically State Department announced that United States are ready to carry out negotiations on the mechanisms of arms control that would replace the START treaty that is set to expire in 2026. Could you explain to us why it's important to have such negotiations, and whether it's actually possible in the current climate of very heated confrontational rhetoric between Washington and Moscow?
First of all, I will say yes, it is possible, even during the very darkest days of the Cold War, when we had deep disagreements over the Vietnam War and over the politics and the fighting in the Middle East. We were able to negotiate to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons and to put in place the major regimes that are at the heart of our efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation. I always say that Soviet diplomats were giants of the non-proliferation treaty regime negotiations. So in the late 1960s into the early 1970s, we were able to negotiate and put in place some really important treaties and agreements that limit and control nuclear weapons. So my answer is yes, even in the midst of crisis, we must be able to negotiate because these weapons are existential threats. They could kill not only Russians and Americans, but people around the globe. So we need to negotiate and control them.
Rose, you argued in your testimony on the Hill that it is in the national interest of the United States to have such mechanisms in place. And I was just wondering, is there a same level of interest in Moscow, and are the stakes equally high?
Both countries have an interest in predictability, and that is what my testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee was all about. The United States is now entering into a modernization of its nuclear arsenal that is needed. I want to stress this is a modernization, not a buildup, because both countries are under the limits of the New START treaty. We can deploy 700 missiles and bombers, same on the Russian side. We can deploy 1,550 warheads to go on those missiles and bombers, same on the Russian side. So there is predictability for both countries. We understand that we are not building up. We are not arms racing with nuclear weapons, and that is very important. But the United States needs predictability while it modernizes its forces. The Russian Federation has already just about completed its own nuclear modernization. And so at this moment, I think it's important for the United States to be able to modernize, but not to be concerned about a buildup of Russian nuclear weapons.
Rose, I guess it's a philosophical question, but when we're talking about non-proliferation and modernization of nuclear forces at the same time, is there some kind of a contradiction there?
There's no contradiction, Yulia, as I see it, as long as limits remain in place under strategic arms reduction treaties. It's what I call a judicious modernization. It is replacing what we already have. Some of these weapons are, from the 1970s or the 1980s. Again, it was the same on the Russian side. They were deploying systems that had been built in the USSR in the 1970s and 1980s. They become dangerous. They become unsafe to operate. They simply become ineffective. And so that's the heart of deterrence, right? That nuclear weapons should never be thought about as weapons that we would use in war. But we need to be confident in their effectiveness if the terrible day ever arrives when they do need to be used. That is the heart of nuclear deterrence, confidence in their effectiveness. So that is the main, I think, point here, that modernization can and should occur for a number of reasons, but it should be kept under limits, and we should continue to look for ways to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons.
Rose, when it comes to the rhetoric, State Department emphasized that such negotiations inevitably require goodwill. Is there a kind of, is it implied that there is goodwill in Washington, but there is no goodwill in Moscow, to your knowledge?
I think both sides have shown goodwill in recent weeks with the quiet work that they are doing to restore the on-site inspections that were stopped during the COVID-19 pandemic, for very good reasons, both countries did not want to send inspectors to the other country because of the pandemic. So now quiet negotiations are going on to reestablish those on-site inspections. I understand that they are moving ahead. I understand that soon the so-called bilateral consultative commission, the implementation body of the New START treaty, will meet to work on resolving implementation issues that come up naturally during the course of a treaty's life. So I think all in all, there is a kind of quiet pragmatism on both sides. Both sides are working the issues. So I see in that quiet and pragmatic technical work the foundations for some perhaps quiet technical discussions about a framework for a new treaty. That's how I think these talks should take place.
Rose, when it comes to the scope of the new treaty, you, as someone who has been working in this field for decades, uh, consider this enough? Kind of START treaty, new START treaty. Are there new additional mechanisms that might be required, considering the context and the situation and how different players emerge and pop up on the nuclear kind of competition stage? Would you say that you would be happy if START treaty is kind of prolonged, or would you want to see something else?
The New START treaty will go out of force in February of 2026. It cannot be extended again, except the sides could agree to keep it in place, but for the United States, that would require it to go through a further ratification process in the US Senate. So in my view, we should work on a new treaty that better suits our needs right now from the United States perspective. The United States would like to see limits on all nuclear warheads, direct limits on all nuclear warheads. And that means getting at some of the so-called non-strategic or tactical nuclear warheads that have been of such concern to the US and its allies during this Ukraine crisis. So putting constraints on Russian tactical nuclear weapons is an objective for the United States in the next negotiations. I know that the Russian side has its own objectives. It has been long concerned about certain highly accurate conventional systems on the US side, so-called prompt global strike systems. So I can imagine that Russia will have objectives of its own. And always that is the case. Countries come to the negotiating table because they both see it in their national security interest to achieve limits on the other side. So that will be very much the case, I am sure, this time around.
When we're talking about arms control these days, it's assumed that it is strategic weapons that need to be covered by the treaties. What about the tactical nukes? Because they're at the center of the discussions and actually the standoff right now.
You know that it's not so much a matter of strategic or non-strategic where the warheads per se are concerned. We call them non-strategic or tactical nuclear warheads, but it's actually their delivery vehicles and the shorter range of their delivery vehicles that determines their status as non-strategic nuclear warheads. So I think that the United States idea is to place limits on all nuclear warheads, deployed and non-deployed, strategic and non-strategic, and that I think helps to lay in lay on the table a potential for compromise because the Russian Federation has long been concerned about the ability of the United States to upload more warheads on its strategic long-range intercontinental delivery vehicles, while the United States has been concerned about Russian non-strategic capabilities, shorter range missiles, shorter range weapon systems that it would also load non-strategic or tactical warheads on. It's a bit confusing, but the basic point is that I can see some trade space there when talking about a limit on all warheads, deployed and non-deployed, strategic and non-strategic.
Rose, if we digress for a second from Russia and if we try to look at China, it seems like the negotiations are obviously heavily concentrated on making Russia to be in compliance and to be agreeing on the new terms or to, extending the old terms. But what about other countries that are nuclear powers, but that are not part of the treaties? And is United States going to be doing something to include, say, China? I don't know about North Korea into such mechanisms.
I think we have to bear in mind that the United States and Russian Federation are still the two largest nuclear powers in the world. We have upwards of 4,000 warheads, each of us. And in China's case, yes, they are modernizing, they are building up their nuclear arsenal. But the estimates that are becoming public say that China will perhaps quintuple its warhead numbers over the next 10 years to the early 2030s. So it's going from 500 warheads approximately to about 1,500 warheads total. So it still is a smaller and will be a smaller nuclear power than Russia and the United States, but it is important to watch carefully what China is doing as it modernizes. And it will also be important to watch, to work very hard to get China to begin to come to the negotiating table, because China so far has not shown any interest really in bilateral negotiations with the United States, or perhaps in parallel with the Russian Federation. I think that here we should focus on systems where China has some equality of capability, like intermediate range missiles that are ground based. And I was very interested back in February when President Putin and Xi Jinping met right before the Beijing Olympics. And in their joint statement, they declared that perhaps we should develop a moratorium on intermediate range missiles in Europe, but also extend that moratorium to Asia. And I thought, that's interesting. That's the first time I've seen Xi Jinping show any interest in placing negotiated constraints on Chinese and presumably US and Russian missile systems. So I think that that's the kind of negotiation that we should be seeking with China at the present time, an area where they have equality of capability and could have a national interest in pursuing limits.
Rose, how concerned are you about North Korea? Because it doesn't seem like it's going to become part of any treaty anytime soon.
I'm very concerned about their missile developments. Just in the last few weeks, they've been launching test missiles flying over our ally Japan, and that is extremely concerning, extremely dangerous as well. And so I do think that it's important to try to continue to engage with the North Koreans. I have to say, in recent years, the diplomacy has been moribund after President Trump tried to meet and work directly, negotiate directly with Kim Jong-un. It simply didn't work. So I think we need to nevertheless look for ways to try to negotiate with North Korea. But here again, we need to also bear in mind that North Korea's nuclear arsenal is very small compared to that of the United States. And its military forces, although quite capable, are also very small. So the United States has a kind of deterrence advantage, I would say, in this case.
Rose, when we're talking about rhetoric and all the words and accusations possibly being exchanged in the last few weeks, President Biden equated the level of nuclear tensions to the times of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he also said that Armageddon has never loomed so close in 60 years. And you wrote, Russia's threats are not identical to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but cooler heads must prevail. To your knowledge, and we're coming back to the diplomacy part of this conversation, are those cooler heads even available in Washington and Russia these days when it comes to these negotiations? Because you mentioned that some quiet technical conversations are being carried out. What about the diplomacy on the high level?
There are very good technical professionals on both sides. As I said, they are working quietly. In my view, this could be a time when we perhaps build some progress from the ground up rather than from the top down. But nevertheless, of course, there are always possibilities for higher level diplomacy, higher level interaction. I know that the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been in touch with his counterpart, and the Secretary of State Tony Blinken has been in touch with Foreign Minister Lavrov. So I think there can also be interactions at a higher level. That's not excluded. But my view is, at the moment, we already have some progress at a technical level. Slow, quiet, perhaps pragmatic, but here is a framework that we can perhaps even now start to build on.
Sounds like pragmatic is what we need these days. But when it comes to, again, to rhetoric, Vladimir Putin several times alluded to the fact that he's not excluding the possible use of tactical nukes. Do you feel that internal criticism in Russia could somehow be a deterrent, enough of a deterrent for President Putin, because there are voices in Russia saying that it is unacceptable?
I have seen some of those voices raised, and I welcome it. But frankly, I think the greatest deterrent is the deterrent that is a political one. In other words, in Soviet times and now in Russian times, there has always been a certain pleasure in the fact that the United States bears the moral burden for the only use of nuclear weapons in wartime at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, for suddenly the Russian Federation to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine or in whatever scenario, and see that moral burden shifting from the United States to Russia for all time, for the future. I think that, in my view, that is a political deterrent and a rather powerful one because uh, I remember Soviet days and I see today that Russia continues to paint the United States with the brush of being the country that has used nuclear weapons in wartime.
Rose, back in 1994, when the hopes for non-proliferation were different and when the Budapest Memorandum was ratified, you acted for that as a chief negotiator. And we lately heard complaints from Ukraine saying that it shouldn't have given up its nuclear weapons. But I understand that you think that giving up nukes for Ukraine, for Belarus, for Kazakhstan, was still a better option and better deal. So if we imagine that Budapest Memorandum has never happened, what would it be now?
My view is that Ukraine, primarily, we're talking about Ukraine these days, but Ukraine, Kazakhstan, well, sadly, Belarus is not a very good case right at the moment, but Ukraine in particular bought itself 30 years in order to build itself up as an independent state, its national self-confidence in place, its economy moving in the right direction until, unfortunately, this destructive war began. But and its democracy beginning to take shape as well. Ukraine has developed as a true independent nation state in these 30 years. My view is if it had insisted on holding on to nuclear weapons, it would have ended up in a clash with Moscow much earlier, and its development as an independent state, a strong and sovereign entity, would have been interrupted. Really, I see the fruits of those 30 years in the way the Ukrainians are fighting so bravely today for their own independence, for their own nationality, for their national sovereignty. So I think that it was an important decision that they made back in 1994, and it has borne fruit.
NATO stressed out that it's a routine exercise and it was not designed to signal Russia. Yet in practice, it's very difficult to perceive that out of the context of rhetorical exchange, and Moscow most likely will just again use it as a way to say that here is the existential threat coming from the alliance. Are there certain risks for both parties to carry out such exercise in such in the times of such heated confrontation over nuclear arms?
Look, we cannot avoid the fact that there has been heated exchange recently, and particularly a lot of nuclear saber rattling from Moscow. And I regret that very much. I think it's irresponsible behavior. But at the same time, October, for many, many years, has been the month of nuclear exercises, both the Steadfast Noon exercise that NATO carries out and the so-called Grom exercise that the Russian Federation carries out. So this has been a long-standing schedule. And one might have argued to interrupt it this year, but I think the fact that NATO is conducting it in a very routine manner with very great transparency. I see from NATO reporting that they have informed the Russian Federation at every step of the way of what the exercise will entail. There are no surprises going to happen. So I think that NATO is also in this way conveying a certain deterrence message. And so that is important as well.
Rose, you were Deputy Secretary of NATO in 2016-2019. Do you feel that there is a good understanding at the alliance about the proverbial red lines of Vladimir Putin? And do you think that ever the alliance will ever want to cross those lines?
Well, Vladimir Putin laid them all out in those so-called draft agreements that the Russian Federation tabled in December of last year. So, of course, the NATO alliance knows what the stated red lines are, but also I believe and I agree with the notion that those stated red lines are ridiculous. The notion that NATO should draw back to the lines that the borders that it occupied in 1997, for example. These are simply not realistic. And in fact, we see NATO moving in the opposite direction with the new membership of Sweden and Finland. So I would say, yes, there's a certain comprehension of the stated red lines from Moscow, but I think at the same time, there's not an embrace or an acceptance of them from the NATO headquarters.
Rose, very last question. When it comes to this, danger, perceived danger of possible direct clash between NATO and Russia, with the latest developments, would you say that this clash is more of a possibility, or the sides will actually stick to the realpolitik and the understanding of realpolitik that it's just way too dangerous to end up in this cycle?
President Biden of the United States and all the NATO leaders have been very clear and firm that they do not want to see this disastrous war in Ukraine turn into a general war in Europe. In other words, into a war involving the NATO alliance. And I know that NATO will do everything it can to avoid that kind of escalatory action. So I think, as far as I can tell, Moscow has the same attitude. It has avoided strikes or accidental strikes on NATO territory, and this, I think, is an important sign that the the sides are deterring each other in this conflict, and I think that that is a good thing. But at the same time, NATO will continue to show its resolve to support Ukraine by providing military assistance and other kinds of assistance as well on the humanitarian side.